Okay, everyone, today should be our last day to discuss World War I. As we were talking about yesterday, World War I was an extremely deadly conflict due to an increase in technology. Okay, we talked about poison gas, we talked about machine guns, but the last technology that we need to talk about is tanks. And tanks are an innovation in military technology that is responsible for ending trench warfare. Tanks don't really come out until towards the end of the war, and throughout the war, technology increases as the war goes on. Trench warfare becomes more elaborate, artillery becomes more accurate, newer and deadlier weapons of war are created, and the tank is the counter to the machine gun. A large box of metal on wheels, tracks, that can travel across muddy battlefields, trample over barbed wire, and repel machine gun bullets to an extent. Now, early tanks are really cumbersome and not very strong and kind of a mess. Set that on my desk, please. But they do eventually start to come into play in World War I, and the British, they're some of the first to really develop tanks. And everybody develops tanks, but like they're not the same as the tanks you think of today. They're like large, metal boxes. But they do eventually overpower trench warfare. And by the end of World War I, trench warfare starts to be defeated by tanks. And in World War II, you don't see a lot of trench warfare in the same way as World War I because of tanks and other things. War was more mobile. But the stalemate on the Western Front was like a meat grinder. And the countries of France and Germany and Britain had pounded and pounded away at each other for about 4 years, okay? Meanwhile, the United States was neutral for the first few years until, like we talked about yesterday, the reasons why we ended up getting involved. Towards the end of the war, in 1917, the tide really starts to change, okay? Let me go back a little bit. We'll get there in just a moment, but for right now, let's talk about the war at home. Okay, when the United States enters World War I, we are not prepared for the war. We are not prepared for the amount of sacrifices we're going to need to make, and we really don't have a large enough army. Throughout World War I, millions of Americans are drafted into service to serve in the U.S. Army. Okay, these Americans that serve, a lot of them are volunteers, but many of them are drafted. And the United States relies on propaganda to increase people's support for the war. This war is a total war. A total war is different from wars that had happened, like say the Spanish-American War. In the Spanish-American War, that war was so quick and over so fast, it really didn't change a whole lot of life for everyday Americans. But World War I affected you whether you were on the battlefield or not. Okay, Americans were encouraged to enlist. Americans were encouraged to work in factories producing war materials. A lot of factories were converted from peacetime production to military production. And at the same time, people were encouraged to conserve food, conserve metals, and conserve resources so that could go to the military, okay? If you look at the middle poster, okay, a victory garden was a way that you could support the war effort without ever fighting or firing a single bullet. Okay, if you plant a garden and you save food, then more food can be sent to soldiers fighting in the war. Soldiers got to have a gun, got to have a helmet, got to have uniforms, got to have bullets, got to have food, got to have shoes. All these things have to be provided for. And when you have a soldier off in Europe fighting, they are not in America working. So there's a need in America for those at home to save every extra scrap they can to send to the soldiers off over there. Okay? And so you see a lot of people enter the workforce that had not before, particularly women. And a lot of women enter the workforce to take the jobs that men left behind when they went to fight in the war, okay? This is a big reason why women got the right to vote in 1920, right after World War I. because women participated fully in the war effort. The women's rights movements and the women's suffrage movement, they supported the war effort wholeheartedly, and that led to some political victories later on, which allowed women to have the right to vote almost immediately after World War I ended. Okay? The United States really wasn't in World War I very long, 1917 to 1918, but it did manage to change some of our culture. Okay? Many things happened during World War I that strained what little there was of a relationship between the United States and Germany. There were a lot of Americans that were from Germany or had ancestry or were even immigrants from countries that now the United States was at war with. Okay? And a lot of propaganda in the war effort was designed to dehumanize the enemy. Okay? Propaganda is images, media, information from the government that is designed to sway you to a certain belief. All of these posters up here are examples of propaganda. The United States actually created a Bureau of Information, okay? That's not the exact name for it, but the United States created a way to regulate the information that people got about the war to make sure that they supported the war effort. You could go to a theater, like a vaudeville theater, and you might end up watching a play that was government propaganda to get people to support the war effort, okay? There were songs that were written to support the war effort, like the very famous song, Over There. You've probably heard it, you can look it up, okay? You might hear it sometimes like Veterans Day assemblies or whatever, they'll have Over There play. There's a lot of military songs, a lot of things that show up in music, there's a lot of things that show up just in newspapers, and there's posters everywhere trying to encourage people to support the war effort, okay? Propaganda in war is designed to do different things, like join the army. I want you for the U.S. Army, not anyone else, you. Is this poster pointing at you? Look at it. Is it pointing at you? Is it pointing at America? How's it pointing at Erica and pointing at Nathan at the same time? It is an interesting artistic technique. You can actually move your head around and that finger is always pointing at you. You can't escape Uncle Sam demanding that you join the U.S. Army. Can't escape. He's still pointing at me. Okay, for real. You can move around and he's always pointing at me. Yeah, look. Move around, look. Look, he's still pointing. Is he still pointing at you? He's pointing at me right now. Isn't that weird? It's weird. Well, you can't escape it. This is your duty. Your country needs you. You can't escape it. Okay? Listen, you might think, oh, well, I'm a woman. I'm not going to go fight in the trenches. Well, look, there's stuff you can do at home. Okay? You can plant a garden. You can work in a factory. You can do something to help those boys out. Okay? And there's also jobs in the military for women. There's a lot of non-combat jobs that women enter into to support the war effort. Okay? And propaganda, sometimes it's more positive, like let's support our boys, let's go fight. And then sometimes it's get rid of this bad guy, okay? Destroy this mad brute, enlist, okay? Why would you draw the Germans as this big, nasty gorilla? He's got a German helmet on with a little spiky poke on the top. Destroy this mad brute. Okay, it's kind of cut off. What? That's how they want you to see him. Why would the government want us to think of the Germans as enemies? Because they're the enemy. But why? Why do we want to think of the enemy as animals? It's easier to hate them. It's easier to kill them. It's a lot easier to shoot a monster than it is to shoot a person. Okay? Imagine if, for a moment, you were playing a video game and you were shooting the bad guys, and after every time you shot someone, then like the video game stopped and be like, you just shot Johnny. Yeah, he's a German, but you know, he had a little Cocker Spaniel at home. He's never going to see his master again. Oh, look, you just shot Heinz. He had just proposed to his girlfriend, and now she's going to be wearing black on her wedding day, okay? And like you just go through and you think about, oh, look at this. This is Roger. He worked on bicycles. He loved bicycles. And that's what he wanted to do, is open his very own bicycle store after the war. Guess what? He'll never get to, because he's dead. Every time you kill someone, you're killing a person with hopes and dreams, a mom, a dad, a life. Okay? But you can't stop and think about that in the trenches when you're chowing down your machine gun and mowing down hundreds of Germans. You can't think about that. You can't think about the fact that they're a human being. The point of being in the military is to go shoot people. And so, well, it's not the only point, okay? But the point is to defend the people at home, obviously, but we're still human beings. And it's hard to kill a person, okay? Because they're a person. But when you think of the enemy as monsters, the Huns, the Krauts, the brutes, okay? These nasty, awful Germans. All they want to do is destroy, and they're awful. Let's go kill them. It's a lot easier to kill them. Okay? Propaganda is used in warfare all the time. And a lot of times what it tries to do is dehumanize the enemy. Okay? You'll see this throughout history. Whenever we have a bad guy, we make images of that bad guy that dehumanize them. Dehumanizing your enemy makes it easier to hate them. Okay? It fights against our tendency to have empathy. But anyways, the entire country mobilizes to win World War I. Mobilization, total war, this is what we do to try to defeat the enemy. And everyone participates, whether you're a soldier or not, okay? Now, how did the Allies win? How did the stalemate get broken? Well, tanks are a part of it. But a big thing happened in 1917. The main two factors that really win World War I is supplies or stuff and numbers of people. This was a war of attrition. And Germany was fighting a two-front war. Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were outnumbered by the Allies, okay? There were lots of countries against them. And let's be honest, Germany was pulling the team, okay? Austria-Hungary could barely handle Italy, okay? The Ottoman Empire, it was getting sniped at the edges by the British and the French. It was falling apart. Germany was fighting Russia and France and Britain basically by themselves and holding them off. Had Germany only fought France, it would have been over very quickly. But Germany was fighting the whole world, and they actually got pretty close to winning. Okay? Germany managed to knock Russia out of the war in 1917. On a side note, in 1917, Russia goes through a communist revolution. Russia was struggling in World War I, and the people of Russia were so frustrated with the Tsar, the Emperor of Russia, that they had a full-scale revolution. There was an earlier revolution in, I think it was February 1917, that got rid of the Tsar, but they kind of had a semi-democratic government for a few months. But then in the October Revolution in 1917, the communists take over. Vladimir Lenin becomes in charge of the Soviet Union, and they start very quickly turning all of Russia into a communist nightmare, getting rid of all the capitalists and anyone who ever opposed communism, taking away people's freedoms of speech, freedoms of press, etc., which really didn't exist a whole lot anyways before in Russia because they had an emperor. But the Russians very quickly are so focused on making Russia communist that they decide to leave World War I, and they negotiate a ceasefire between them and Germany defeats Russia, okay? Russia loses World War I, and they spend the next few years fighting themselves in a massive civil war between the white Russians and the red Russians. The red Russians were the communist Russians, the white Russians were the non-communists, and that war lasts for many years, so they have their own mess to deal with. But that means in 1917 that Germany, who had been able to fight both at the same time and basically tie, now could take all their soldiers that had been fighting the Russians and bring them to France and England. And so France and England were very happy that the United States entered World War I in 1917. In the spring of 1918, there is Germany's last big offensive push to win the war. In 1917, not a lot of Americans were actually in World War I because it took a few months to train soldiers, to put them in, boats, sail them over to France, and actually get them starting to fight. Okay, it took some time to get everything together. So really, American soldiers were only on the ground fighting for the last year of the war in 1918, but they came just in the nick of time because the full first force of Germany's army attacked France once more in 1918, and they got pretty close. They got within, I think, 100 miles to Paris, the capital of France, and they almost broke the Allies. But every day, more and more Americans were coming to France to fight against the Germans. France and Britain wanted the United States to just kind of spread out along the trenches and be under the command of France and Britain. But the United States, led by General John Pershing, remember that guy that was hunting Pancho Villa a few years ago? John Pershing was the main commander of the United States forces in World War I. He was also the main commander fighting a lot of the Filipinos in the Philippine Revolution. So remember that, Leslie, for the social studies exam. But General Pershing, he is very, very effective at leading American troops, and he keeps all the American soldiers in like one section of the line, okay? And Americans get a big taste of battle at the Battle of Belleau Wood and the Argents Forest, okay? There's some big, nasty battles in that spring offensive, and Americans, even though many thought that they wouldn't be successful. A lot of the French and British, they would refer to the Americans as the doughboys because they came to France and England where they had been fighting war for 4 years and a lot of people were starving. They didn't have enough food. They're really scrawny. And the Americans came and they were like, they had been eating. They were kind of fat. Not fat. Like the average weight of a World War I soldier was like 130 pounds, 140 pounds. People are bigger now. And these are like 18-year-old men, okay? But people literally are bigger now. I'm not just like saying fat. I'm saying normal people that are not fat today in America are way bigger than people were back in World War I. If you go look at a museum and look at like the clothing from people back then, you might think, oh, that looks like kids' clothes. No, those are adults. You see, we eat more. And we eat more when we're kids. And it's like critical. Your height actually can change based off of your diet, okay, over the course of your lifetime. So like the foods that people eat, and now a lot of it's genetic, but in general, if someone is malnourished, they tend to be smaller than someone who eats a lot, okay, and not just like wide. I'm talking tall too. So anyways, but even then, even though American soldiers by our standards today would have been considered tiny, according to like France and British, they were like big and pudgy because they hadn't been starving in the war. America, we fought in World War I, but we did not have the devastation to our home country like the people of Europe had after 4 years of grueling conflict, okay? So the Americans, they show up, and even though some people thought they were, they would fall apart when the cannon started firing, they took their hit and they fought back very, very effectively, okay? One of the most famous units in World War I is the Harlem Hellfighters, which was a segregated unit of African Americans, and they fought with distinction at the Battle of Belleau Wood. And the American soldiers, led by John Pershing, push through and break the German lines. And the Germans start to retreat. And Germany in World War I, once they start to retreat, they realize that they are going to collapse. Over the course of 1918, the United States and the Allies hold back Germany's offensive. They turn the tide and they start pushing back into Germany. And by November, Germany realizes that the jig is up. And so they agree to a ceasefire that takes effect at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, 1918. And that is the armistice that ends the shooting part of the war, okay? Not a peace treaty, it's an armistice. This was for many, many years remembered as Armistice Day across the world and in America. And then after World War II, the United States changed the day to be Veterans Day. where now we remember veterans of all wars, okay? But, which is really weird because they actually fought up until 11 o'clock that morning. So like there were people that died on the last day of World War I, like within minutes of like when the war is over, which is kind of stupid. But they were like, we got to shoot all these cannons off. We might not get to use them again in a while. So, you know, they were like shooting cannons and blowing stuff up and shooting at each other until 11 o'clock. And then it was like, okay, we're done. Which to me, kind of silly, but awful. But anyways, you ever seen those fairy tale movies like Little Red Riding Hood or whatever, you know, where they're in like a big, deep, dark forest and there's the big bad wolf hiding? A lot of times those forests in those sort of movies and those ideas are based off of forests in Germany called the Black Forest, okay? And the Black Forests in Germany are super thick and lush and rich, and they're so thick that when you're in them, it's like dark, even though it's daytime, okay? This is what those forests kind of look like after World War I. Okay, when you shoot cannons and blow stuff up and early flamethrowers and other horrible weapons of war are used over and over and over again. But anyways, eventually the United States and the Allies win. And so the question becomes, what do we do now that we've won? President Woodrow Wilson has a plan. Remember, Woodrow Wilson, college professor. That's kind of his outlook and attitude when it comes to figuring things out, okay? Woodrow Wilson studies World War I. He thinks about the causes and the consequences, okay? If we look up the actual casualties, do I have the number of casualties? I do not. We can look up. I don't have the number off the top of my head, but we're talking. It was several million. I think it's around 11. I don't want to say like 11 million or whatever and then be wrong. Okay. But anyways, this is a massive war. Millions of people die. 4 years of destruction and suffering across the world. And for what? Okay, here we go. Okay. Of the 2 million Americans, there are 2 million Americans that served in France in World War II. America lost around 116,000 men dead, 200,000 wounded. This was a very small number compared to the other countries. 100,000 deaths, though, is a pretty big deal in a war. That's more than the Vietnam War and the Korean War combined. Okay, or it's really close. But compared to the other countries of the world, it was nothing. Germany lost 1.8 million young men. Russia lost 1.7 million. France, 1.4 million. Austria-Hungary lost 1.2 million, and almost 1 million British people died in the war. Okay, we're talking millions and millions of deaths, and a lot of those deaths were civilians, not combatants, but civilians. People got caught in the crossfire. A lot of these battles happened in cities. A lot of these battles happened in the countryside, and people got killed, okay? So you have millions and millions of death. Nobody wants to go through another world war ever again, especially Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson looks at the causes of World War I. Remember, we went through the main causes of World War I: militarism, alliance system, imperialism, nationalism. He looks at those same causes that we look at. And he determines a plan. He says, if we can do 14 things, I have 14 points. If we can do these 14 points, we will never have another world war again. So he goes to the city of Versailles, France. And there, Woodrow Wilson and the leaders of the Allies, Britain and France, they discuss the peace treaty. And Woodrow Wilson's 14 points are, and you don't have to memorize all of these, but I'm just going to go through them, okay? Number 1, open diplomacy. Get rid of these secret alliances that nobody knows about, that kick in when a war starts. So that way we don't have a little conflict between two countries become a conflict over the whole world. Freedom of the seas. Remember, they're shooting at Americans in ships out on the ocean. We don't want that to happen again. Let's let the seas be free. Nobody owns the ocean. Everyone can use the ocean. Number 3, removal of economic barriers. Let's trade with one another. The more you trade with another country, the less likely you are to fight with them. Because if you start fighting, then your money goes away from trade. Number 4, reduction of armaments. Let's reduce that militarism. That way we are less likely to go to war. Number 5, adjustment of colonial claims. A lot of the reasons for conflict were imperial reasons, okay? Britain and France and Germany and all these countries have been squabbling over Africa and Asia. Let's get these colonial claims settled so we're not fighting about them anymore. Okay? He had some issues with the conquered territories in Russia. He wanted those to go back. Okay? He wanted to settle some things. The rest of these, 6 through 13, all have to do with nationalism. He wanted to make sure that nations had self-determination and that nations were independent rather than being conquered by some big empire. So he wanted Belgium to be safe. He wanted France's borders to be redrawn, Italy's borders to be redrawn. He wanted Austria-Hungary to be divided up into smaller countries that better represented the nations that lived inside Austria-Hungary. He wanted to redraw the boundaries of the Balkans. He wanted to limit Turkey. He wanted to establish an independent country called Poland, which would serve as a buffer state between Russia and Germany. But the last and most important part of Woodrow Wilson's points was he wanted an association of nations, a league of nations, where all the countries in the world could gather together to discuss their problems and therefore avoid war. What if instead of Archduke Franz Ferdinand getting shot and then 12 million people getting killed in a 4-year war, what if we had said, hold the brakes, let's talk about our problem. Yes, somebody got shot. That's sad. That's a bad thing. But do we really need to kill like 12 million people in a 4-year-long war that cost billions and billions of dollars because Archduke Franz Ferdinand got shot? Like, I'm sure he was a nice guy, but is that worth it? You know what I mean? Let's have a place where we can talk about our problems and avoid a war. So Woodrow Wilson, he gets his 14 points together. He puts them up in a nice briefcase. He gets all his things together, and he goes to the Treaty of Versailles, ready to negotiate. And France and Britain reject all of the 14 points except for number 14. You see, Woodrow Wilson wanted a lasting peace, but Britain and France wanted revenge. They wanted revenge on Germany. You see, America, we only lost 100,000 people, which is bad. But we fought over there. Our country stayed relatively safe. We didn't have the huge loss of lives or bombings of cities and destruction that Britain and France dealt with. And Britain and France have a long, long rivalry with Germany, and this is their chance to beat them up while they're down. So the Treaty of Versailles is a treaty that does not really set up anything like peace, but rather what it does is punish the Central Powers. The Ottoman Empire totally dissolved. Turkey is all that is left. The rest of the Ottoman Empire's territory becomes Britain and France's colonies. Austria-Hungary completely and totally dissolved, turned into a jumbled mess of tiny countries. Okay? Germany, it is cut down and trimmed excessively. A lot of its territory is taken away from it. All of Germany's colonies taken away. Germany's military limited by the treaty permanently. Well, until they break the treaty. But Germany is forced to reduce their military. They lose land. They lose their colonies. They are forced to write out that they were responsible for the war. Germany has to apologize. But most importantly, Germany is forced to pay reparations.
Teacher Department's in Russia. If we have any junior students who will be taking the April the 17th ACT test, and you have not completed your registration or signed up, today is the deadline to get signed up. So if you need some help, you You go see Ms. Coleman in the library at this time. That's for any junior students
Have you all
who have
signed
not
up for the
signed up,
ACT?
or seniors.
Okay.
You need to get signed up. Today is the deadline.
All
Thank
right.
you.
If y'all need to go sign up, you can. Does anyone need to go sign up? All right. So Germany is forced to pay reparations, which are payments to rebuild Britain and France and pay for all the damages caused in the war. So Germany has to rebuild their own country. They lost almost 2 million young men. Okay. They have had large portions of their countryside destroyed and a lot of their territory taken away from them. Their colonies are taken away, and now they have to rebuild their country while paying Britain and France money every day to pay for their countries. Germany didn't finish paying off the reparation payments, I think, until like the 1990s and 2000s. Now, they took a break from paying their payments, but they had to repay those payments for decades. Okay. Now, do you imagine how difficult that was for Germany? Now, Germany was kind of an aggressor in the war, but it's not like Britain and France were just like minding their own business and then Germany attacked them. It was a big ordeal. There's more to it than just that. Woodrow Wilson is super frustrated with the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles, let's just imagine for a moment that our good friend Presley and our good friend Marissa, they get in a fight, okay? And Marissa defeats Presley. And Presley is lying on the ground and she's been defeated. And Marissa just starts kicking her. Just starts kicking her some more and kicking her some more and just kicking her and kicking her. And then when she's a nice bloody pulp, then she says, "Now apologize. This is your fault." And then after she apologizes, then she says, "All right, now give me your wallet because you got your blood on my shoes and now you have to buy me a new pair of shoes." That's kind of what Britain and France did to Germany. Okay, they beat them in the war, they kicked them while they're down, they forced them to say, "I'm sorry," and then they said, "Now pay us to replace the shoes that you got your blood on." Okay, that's kind of what happens. So Germany is immediately sent into an economic downturn. Germany goes into a deep, dark economic depression. It gets so bad that Germany has to just print out money. They have payments every year that they have to make, and they have no money to make the payments. So they just start printing off money on paper. And there comes a certain point where inflation comes into play. Inflation is when prices go up, but what really is going on is inflation is your money becomes less valuable. Inflation kind of happens all the time. You notice that as you get older, things become more expensive. That's not just you. That's literally money is actually becoming less valuable every year because there's a lot of economics going on, but essentially there's more and more money. And so the price of money goes down. Well, with paper money, it gets to the point where you lose faith in money, okay? See, American money is backed up by the force of the American government, okay? You believe that a dollar is a dollar because you believe it's worth a dollar. And if you don't trust the government backing up that dollar, then the money is worthless, okay? Germany just starts printing off money, and eventually it just becomes paper. There are literally moments in Germany where people could have a basket full of money and the basket is worth more than the money inside the basket, okay? Because they just keep printing off money to send to Britain and France to make the reparations. It destroys their economy. And Germany goes through an awful, awful economic depression for decades, which is what allows for someone crazy like Nazis to take over the country because the people get desperate. They're desperate for someone to rescue them. Meanwhile, Woodrow Wilson is frustrated, okay? Britain and France don't listen to him. They don't pay any attention, even though we bailed them out of World War I. They probably could have lost very easily, or the war could have dragged on for several more years if we had not gotten involved. And then we don't really get anything we want except for the League of Nations. But Woodrow Wilson believes in the League of Nations. He knows that if all the countries of the world could just get together and start negotiating and talking about their problems and working together, we could have less war. So Woodrow Wilson goes back home to the United States to get the treaty approved. The way the Constitution works is that for a treaty to be signed, the president negotiates treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. George Washington tried to get the advice of the Senate to negotiate a treaty once, and it did not work out that well. He was super frustrated. And so all the presidents since George Washington, they ignore that advice part and they just focus on the consent. For a treaty to be approved, the US Senate has to vote to approve it. Okay? And so Woodrow Wilson negotiates the treaty, he brings it back to the United States, he signed it, but it doesn't matter unless the Senate approves the treaty. And the US Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles. Why? Because America wanted to be isolationist again. George Washington told us that we shouldn't get involved in foreign nations. And we didn't listen to him, and we fought in World War I, spent billions of dollars, and what did we get in return? What did the Treaty of Versailles give to the United States? The League of Nations, I guess. Other than that, squat diddly nothing, okay? Think about just a few years earlier with the Spanish-American War. That was a tasty treaty right there. 1898, Treaty of Paris. We get the Puerto Rico. We get the island of Guam. We get the Philippines. We get all these goodies. It's great. Think about that Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo back in the 1840s. We fight against Mexico, and we get like California, New Mexico, and Arizona, and all this stuff. Okay? That's the kind of treaty Americans like. The Treaty of Versailles doesn't do anything for us. We spent billions of dollars and lost hundreds of thousands of American lives and made all these sacrifices so France and Britain could be freed from Germany. And then how do they treat us after we help them so much? They don't even listen to any of Woodrow Wilson's ideas except for one. That's baloney. Okay? That's what a lot of Americans feel. A group of people called isolationists. They were led by Republican Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. And Henry Cabot Lodge and other Republican senators and other people across the country said, World War I was a mistake. We should have, if France and Britain didn't want to appreciate our help, we should just let the Germans eat them. We shouldn't have saved their heinies. We should have just let them get conquered by Germany because they didn't care about us. Why should we care about them? If we join this League of Nations, we'll be having our arms and hands tied up by the rest of the world. Uncle Sam's going to be tied up by that League of Nations, and all those foreign countries are going to be able to have a say in our business. And so many Americans did not like the treaty because the League of Nations, they felt, would restrict our sovereignty. America needs to be able to do whatever it wants, and it shouldn't have to listen to some collection of European countries telling us what to do off in Belgium or whatever. Okay, the League of Nations, that's all well and good, but we need to focus on ourselves and do our own thing. And so the U.S. rejects the League of Nations. This just absolutely ruins Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, he wants the League of Nations so bad. He knows it's what we need to stop another world war from happening. He knows that if the American people would just listen, they would see that we're not going to lose our sovereignty, but that America could be the leader of the world and that we could bring in an era of peace and prosperity to the world that has never been seen before. So Woodrow Wilson goes on tour all across the country, making speech after speech after speech, trying to convince people to support the League of Nations. He travels back and forth and back and forth. And the stress gets so severe that Woodrow Wilson has a stroke, a debilitating stroke. A stroke is when you have a blood clot in your brain. It can kill you. For Woodrow Wilson, it didn't kill him, but it left him stuck in his bed, and he could just barely communicate. And most people who heard Woodrow Wilson talk couldn't understand what he was saying. Kind of just like gurgled. Okay. The only person who had any idea what Woodrow Wilson was saying was Edith Wilson, his wife.
How did he get to be president if he can barely talk?
No, this was after.
Oh.
He was president. Yeah, he was elected in 1912. He's reelected in 1916. This is at the end of his presidency. He's after World War I, like 1918, 1919, okay? He's trying to convince people to support the League of Nations, and he gets so stressed out, and he's overworked, and he's kind of old, he has a stroke. And so for the last year or so of his presidency, he was stuck in his bed and couldn't leave. And nobody could talk to him and understand what he said, except for his wife, Edith Wilson. So what would happen is someone would have a question for the president, and Mrs. Wilson would say, listen, he's not feeling well. Ask me, what do you want to tell the president? And I'll tell him, and I'll tell you what he says. So they would tell Mrs. Wilson. She would go into the room, she'd talk to her husband. He would go, and then she'd be like, okay, this is what he wants you to do. Okay.
What if she was just making it up? And
A lot of people think that Mrs. Wilson was our first woman president because she was doing the job for her husband because he was sick, and he was, at the point of death. Now, do I have any proof? Anyways, a lot of people believe that Mrs. Wilson was kind of acting as president, and so she's not like technically, but she probably is our first woman doing the job of being president. Okay. Anyways, so Woodrow Wilson, he's too sick. He can't campaign for the League of Nations. And so the isolationists win. We reject the League of Nations, and the League of Nations does become a thing, but it really has no power. Okay. The League of Nations just becomes a place for people to get together and argue. And then they can't do anything to back up their arguments. Because if you have an association of all the nations of the world, but you're missing the most powerful nation, then there's no real backing. Had the United States joined, it might have had the force to prevent conflict. After World War II, when the League of Nations failed to stop World War II from happening, the United Nations was formed, which replaced the League of Nations, was much stronger, and the U.S. joined, and it's worked out a lot better. But the League of Nations was a nice idea, but it didn't really work because the U.S. wasn't involved. And there's other reasons, but the big one is the U.S. didn't join, so the League of Nations is dead out of the gate, right? Just dead on the water. Now, World War I ends, the United States goes through a horrible pandemic, worse than the one that we are in right now, called the Spanish flu. Okay? The Spanish flu is probably not from Spain. It was just that during World War I, there was so much censorship, people didn't report on the influenza pandemic except for in Spain, which was neutral. So they called it the Spanish flu, but it was probably all over the place. Okay? The Spanish flu, in the United States, it first appeared at Fort Riley, Kansas on March 11, 1918, right at the end. Okay? It was an influenza that was extremely dangerous. Okay, within a day, it went from 1 soldier to 107. Within a week, there was 500 soldiers, and pretty soon the flu spread across the whole country and the whole world. The first wave produced few deaths, but it mutated over the next year. Victims experienced symptoms of vomiting, dizziness, labored breathing, incessant sweating. It got really bad, and sufferers eventually drowned in their own bodily fluids from the pneumonia that accompanied the infection. Okay? For every 50 people infected, 1 died. There's a 2% death rate for infection, which is way worse than the coronavirus. Okay. Anyways, it ended up killing hundreds of thousands of people in America, at least 600,000, which was more than the battle deaths in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the war in Vietnam combined. And this became a pandemic. And the United States was actually probably the country least affected by the pandemic because it went all across the whole world. And you have to realize there are all these soldiers, all these groups, like it just spread really fast. It probably killed somewhere in the neighborhood of, what does our book say? 50 million. Okay. Conservative estimates place the number of dead people from the Spanish flu from 1918-1919 at 50 million. So more people died from the Spanish flu than World War I. But that's like back-to-back double whammy. You got World War I and the Spanish flu really bad. After that, though, the United States goes through a big period of prosperity called the Roaring '20s, which you're going to watch about in the video that I have for you. And you're going to learn about the Great Depression over spring break, okay? So I'll send you those links hopefully today. Okay, there's 2 videos, the Roaring Twenties and the Great Depression. And so when we actually come back to school next week, we should start learning about World War II. I'm so sorry that I'm having to do this to you guys, but you got a week off of school from February and you didn't have to do any homework then. So anyway, and you just gotta watch some videos. Watch some videos, take some notes on them. Yes. Watch the videos, take some notes, do the smart book. And the last thing I want you to know, I want you to look at this painting right here. A very important man drew this painting. Important doesn't always mean good. After World War I, there was a young, aspiring artist who had big dreams of becoming an artist, but his paintings just weren't good enough. And honestly, I feel like that's pretty good paint. I couldn't do that. Anyways, so he decided to go into a different field, politics. Okay, and this young German artist became the most hated man in the world, Adolf Hitler. Okay, who was actually a soldier in World War I. World War I, Adolf Hitler was a message runner. And that was like one of the most dangerous jobs in World War II because you had to run from trench to trench to trench, delivering messages and like getting shot at. And like Hitler loved it. He was like, this is great, this is junkie, so like adrenaline. But then he tried art, that didn't work. And so listen, if one dream doesn't work out for you, don't be afraid to try something different, okay? All right, maybe art's not for you. Maybe politics is, okay? There are things we can learn from it. All right. On that note, I hope that you all have a wonderful spring break. Be looking for an email from me soon where I'm going to give you some videos to watch, okay?